Man, power is it's a loaded word.
It is.
You know, we obviously think about like governmental power and superpowers.
Indeed. The Avengers come to mind.
But I think that power really comes down to influence. It really comes down to, that ability to influence people. I mean, when you talk about powers, a lot of times we're talking about leadership. And so people that are in leadership have the ability to influence people and push people and position people. So I think that's where I'd start with the definition of power.
Yeah, I do like your starting point of influence. And as I was kind of thinking through our preparation for this episode and just some of the kind of packaged definitions that are out there, from sociologists, influence does seem to be the common thread, right? So there's this idea that power is the capacity of people to be able to do something that they've got in mind, something that they intend, but even if there's some resistance from other folks involved. So it's really this idea that some person is able to influence some other person to do something that they otherwise probably wouldn't have done. But that there is some kind of intent, or at least a collection of preferences behind that influence. And so for me, with that kind of layered definition of kind of influence in mind, then that expands it for me, right? Now it's not just leadership and government, although I agree with you. That's a huge part of what I think about when I think about power. But I also think about relationships too, like just one-on-one with that working definition in mind. Because if you think about it, I think a lot of us, if we look back on certain relationships, have noticed that, like, man, I think I was like doing stuff that I wouldn't normally do in that relationship. And sometimes that comes down to the kind of power that another person had in that relationship that we may not have even realized at that point, but they did have a series of preferences or intent that they were able to influence us to align with. And we didn't even see it coming.
I think especially when we're talking about power differentials, that's something that's not always easy to see. It manifests itself in a lot of different ways. You may have a power imbalance that you notice and the other person doesn't.
Very much.
But that could still manifest itself in the way that they treat you, the way they talk to you. The way they even like direct you indirect. Like maybe it's not, they're not in a supervisory role over you, but they still may be trying to influence you and point you in certain directions. So power isn't always something that's so obvious and blatant. It's something that you see and be like, oh, wow. Sometimes it's, you look back and you're like, wow, I was really influenced heavily by this person.
And didn't even realize it. Which then naturally makes me think about how we tend to talk about manipulation. Because manipulation, I think, is also very much about influence, but it's that covert, undercover influence a lot of times that you were just talking about. But I think it's also, too, a question of when you're looking at two people, how many choices does one person tend to have at their disposal compared with the other person, right? And what impact does one person have on the number of choices that the other person has? Like sometimes people behave in ways within a relationship where they don't realize that they're limiting the other person's choices, but they really are. And I think that becomes a question of power as well, because now you are influencing that other person, not necessarily in this very overt and even like intentionally directed way, but you're influencing them by the way that you're limiting the choices that they have at their disposal.
I think that's also a part of powers. When you're in power, you have power. You have a different set of options that are available to you. And when you are at a power deficit, you don't have those same choices. Exactly. You don't have those same options and opportunities. So that's a really important distinction to make there.
Yeah, and I think for me, being able to see that as an element also I mean, it's so interesting the more we talk about this, how the definitions kind of expand and make room for more things, right? So I think another thing it makes room for is social justice, right? Because if power can be a question of how someone influences the number of choices someone else has, now you begin to ask questions about, wow, like, okay, when I go and vote and I make decisions based on what kinds of resources are available to a certain segment of a community, that then limits or opens up the kinds of choices that they have. And so now I have used my power in a way that has directly impacted, or indirectly, right? Because, I mean, you didn't go to somebody's house and say something like, oh, now you can't go to this school, or now your school doesn't have certain kinds of lunches or resources, right? You didn't directly do that. But you did use your power and influence in a way that eventually limited the choices of other people.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think back to the I guess it was 2020 election, or 2016?
It's all a blur.
It is. All of the years are starting to.
One of them.
It was the Trump election. Let's just
say what it is.
I think that's what made it, for a lot of people of color particularly, made it really painful time, because I think we all went into that election thinking, oh, this is not going to happen. Like when we actually vote, people are going to look at this and see it for what it is, and we're going to understand it is not going to happen. It just can't happen. And even as we're watching things unfold start to happen, you just keep thinking, all right, yeah, it started out bad, but
the denial,
it's not going to happen. And so I think that power piece, that for a long time we've had that belief that eventually people's better natures will come forward and quote unquote save us from this calamity. But if you don't understand the power of your vote, what it means to be a privileged person in whatever status you have, you don't understand how your decisions affect the whole, how it affects everybody.